So we're going to go over how to create HDR images. HDR images are high dynamic range images. Basically what that means is you can take multiple exposures using different exposure settings, some darker, some lighter, and some at approximately the average of the scene, and then combine all those images together, and the result is you can see farther into the shadows and you can see more of the highlights. It takes all these different brightness levels that the camera can't see all at one time, and it sort of squishes them down together so that you can create an image that can look pretty normal, but you can see a bigger dynamic range, a bigger range of brightnesses and darknesses in your images. In your image, but they can also look sort of surreal and painterly. You can do some kind of crazy things. So just to show you a few examples first, I think I have a link on the website to this page which has some tips. We'll get to that in a minute. There's also, I think, a link to this site. This is Stuck in Customs. This is Trey Radcliffe's site and has a lot of great resources to do HDRs. And examples and tutorials and stuff, and here's some examples of his work. So this kind of stuff is harder to do when you have things that are moving. What people usually like, or a lot of times like to do HDRs of, is things like landscapes where not much is moving, right? So you just basically set up on a tripod usually, which we'll get to. You shoot multiple exposures of the same scene, and then you combine all those. What you use to combine all those is usually two different pieces of software, or two options. You can use Photoshop. If you have CS5 or above, it works pretty decently. Below, I think CS5 or maybe CS4, it doesn't work that well in Photoshop. People used to always use, and still do use, this program here, which is called Photomatics. And I may take you through both ways. You'll see the differences. But anyway, so it makes it a little more complicated when you do images like this where you have things that are moving. Obviously these are fireworks are moving, but what HDR is good at is combining all these different brightnesses. So here we have a foreground and we have the sky, and it's also good for very dramatic skies, because usually if you have clouds in the sky is usually overexposed, or often overexposed, because you're exposing for the land, which is darker usually. So what HDR allows you to do is put those together. So here's some different HDRs of his. You can do them as interiors as well, and they can kind of have this strange look where lighting looks sort of unnatural. They're also used in architecture more, because you can shoot interiors using natural light, and then you'll have light coming in the window that would normally be blown out or overexposed, but you can get a better exposure, the correct exposure for the window as well, not in this one, and then you can see outside and it's not overexposed because you're shooting more than one image. One is for the outside through the windows, and one is through the inside. Here's another one, so you can see this sort of glowing look to things. That's kind of an HDR thing. Here's one other one. See how the city kind of glows, but you can also see, obviously, this in the real scene was much darker than this, probably because of the lights and things. But because you're shooting more than one exposure, you can get one for this, maybe one for the sky. Here's another one. Another thing that you'll see in HDR sometimes is this sort of halo, because the sky was brighter. So when you combine those, the transition area sometimes has this sort of halo. I don't see it a whole lot on this one, but sometimes you'll see it more. Not necessarily good or bad. Here's another one, like a beach scene. Hard to shoot into the sun and get a shot. Here's another one. This would be really hard to do normally, because you have a sun in the shot, which is very, very bright, obviously, and then you're going to have this stuff, which was pretty dark. Here's some more natural looking ones. So you can do beautiful landscapes with HDR, or more kind of surreal scenes like that. If you go to Flickr and look up, if you do a search and you put in HDR, you'll find the HDR group. So there's a whole group of HDR images and photographers, and you will see just amazing things in here, even including HDR panoramas, which maybe we'll see in a second. But here's an example. This is what I mean by you can have this sort of crazy painterly look to images. And that looks like maybe it was manipulated quite a bit, but you can do some pretty amazing things, whether you like that look or not, or you can make them look more normal. But again, what it's good at is landscapes, where you can combine. This looks like a painting, right? You can combine these dramatic skies, so it helps to have a dramatic sky for obviously for these. You can combine these dramatic skies and the foreground in the same shot. Here's another example. So just kind of beautiful, almost painterly kinds of images. Let me see if I can quickly find one that's a pano. Let me do HDR pano. So panorama is a image that is stitched together sideways. If you can think of a, here's an HDR pano, I think. If you think of an HDR as images multiple combined through layers, you know, of the same scene, pano is moving the camera as you do it. So you can stitch together all these images to see a wide sort of panoramic type images. Let me see if I can see another one that's interesting. Here, maybe this one. Yeah, see, so we're seeing a wider angle of view than we normally would see because he shot or she shot multiple images, maybe 3, 4, 5 images, stitched them all together horizontally, which is called a pano, and then also made them into an HDR. So here is a non-HDR version from the same day, the same image. So what the HDR allows you to do is combine this dark foreground with this lighter sky into the same shot. So part of the limitation with digital photography is you have digital cameras mostly, you have sort of a sliver of brightnesses that you can see, sort of comparable to slide film in the old days. So if there's brightnesses and darknesses, shadows and highlights in the image that are outside that range, they just get black or white. So what HDR allows you to do is put those together. So just some HDR tips before we actually do one. Use a tripod. Definitely use a tripod if possible. That keeps you from moving the camera. A lot of the software can actually correct for movement in the scene, but it's much better if you don't move the camera. Much easier. Bracket your shots with shutter speed so the depth of field doesn't change. So you're going to want to use stay at a constant aperture so that your depth of field doesn't change from shot to shot, because that will definitely mess it up. It just won't go together very well. But since you're just changing shutter speed, your depth of field doesn't change and everything goes together. So use aperture priority because of that, or manual, and auto bracket if possible. So you'll have to check your camera. Most of the SLRs from Canon and Nikon have a way to auto bracket, meaning you don't have to really, you set it up, but then once you set it up, you just shoot, and then it'll shoot a correct exposure. It'll shoot some under and some over. Generally, it's a good idea to use autofocus before shooting, but use manual focus while you're shooting. So focus, turn off the autofocus, and then leave it so that it doesn't change from shot to shot. Again, so you don't try to combine two shots that have different focus points. Shoot 3 shots minimum with a normal exposure and 1 brighter and 1 darker. So 3 is kind of the minimum. Sometimes more are necessary depending on the scene. The higher the dynamic range, the more images you might have to use. But 3 is kind of the minimum. Use more images for higher contrast scenes, like we said. Make sure you get an image with good exposure of the deepest shadows to avoid noise. Shoot raw if possible, because your raw images are going to have more dynamic range in them already, so that kind of adds to it. Many times you can get good results from 3 exposures. Not always, but sometimes. 1 normal shot, 1 2 stops under, and 1 2 stops over. And then you combine using Photoshop merge to HDR or Photomatics. And there's another tip I think on this page that it's actually a better idea to, if you maybe you're going to shoot 4 images, shoot more of the darker ones than the lighter ones, because the dark is where you're going to have trouble with noise and things like that. And then the rest of this page is kind of about settings for Photomatics, which we will look at. Okay, so we're going to shoot a quick little HDR shot of this backyard. A couple of things. I've already focused here, and then I've set my camera to manual focus after that, if you can see that, because I don't want the focus to change during the shot. I'm also using a cable release. So a cable release will let you set off the camera without vibrating it by even touching it. So
Used to be you could get cheaper cable releases. They would just screw in and you would press a plunger and it was all mechanical. They were cheap. Now cameras usually have a proprietary kind of button. So this is more money. I'm not sure how much it was, but it's definitely more than the older ones were. And so I've got a manual setting. I'm also going to, or manual focus, and I'm going to set the camera up to do bracketing. So bracketing is when you're going to shoot more than one shot of the same scene, and it will automatically adjust the exposure, some higher and some lower. So on this camera, I'm going to press the function button, and you probably can't see this on the video, but I'm going to do one-stop increments, and I'm going to roll the wheel until I get 7 shots there. So on the Canon, you can only set your bracketing up to 1 f-stop. I think on the Canon you can do 2. So mine is set to shoot 7 shots with 1-stop increments. So I'll get 1 shot that's normal, 1 that's 1 stop under, 2 under, and 3 under, and then the other one is 1 over, 2 over, and 3 over. So that should probably do it. Usually you're going to need at least 3 shots to do an HDR, but sometimes you need more depending on the scene. Also, a lot of people recommend to shoot more in the dark side than the light side because the shadows are where you're going to have trouble. So now all I have to do is, since I have this set to bracket my shots, it's going to shoot a normal shot and then it's going to shoot my over and under exposures. I'm also going to set this to continuous low so that it will shoot all 7. So all I'm going to do is press the button, and if you heard it went 7 times and it shot 7 images, and it's all done pretty much. What I will have trouble with is if there was any movement, like if there was any movement over here with these the leaves blowing a little bit, because we're going to combine all these different exposures into one shot. They may not combine well if there's movement. So there probably was, but we'll see what happens. And there's things you can do a little bit to get around that, but we'll see what we get with that.
All right, so now we're going to take those images and make them into an HDR. So things have kind of changed a couple times in Photoshop, so this may be a little bit different than other versions may do it, but I'm in the 2018 version, I think, but it seems to change all the time. But anyway, I'm going to go up to File and go to Automate and merge to HDR Pro. And then you'll get a dialog where you can choose the files you want to use. I'm going to go to Browse. And I'm going to pick those images that we shot, or I shot. I'm going to choose the NEF files, which are the RAW files. You might get better results using the RAW files than the JPEG files, but it also works with JPEGs. But I'm going to use the RAW files. I'm going to go, because there's more data in the RAW files, I'm going to go to Open, and then I'm going to make sure this is checked, Attempt to automatically align source images. So you should have, I think like we said, you should use a tripod, but if you didn't, you might want to check that, and then it might help to align the images. Sometimes it might be wrong. It's definitely good to use a tripod. All right, so this part it might take a little bit. It's trying to crunch through all those images, and they're pretty big images, and they have a lot of data in them as far as the bit depth go. The bit depth, again, is how much data is used to store the color of each pixel, so it makes the file sizes bigger, but it also gives you more dynamic range in your image. All right, so it came up. So you'll see this dialog box. Down here at the bottom, you see these different frames. Those are the images that we used. If you didn't want to use one, you could uncheck these and not use it. So maybe I'll uncheck this. Well, I'll just leave them. There's 7 of them. I might not need this really dark one. Or the really light one maybe, but and you could use a minimum of 3 images probably, but I'll leave them all on and see how that goes. So over here on the right you have your settings. So it may come up this way under 16-bit, or it may come up as 32-bit. So if it's 16-bit, there are a bunch of built-in presets here. They are not too hot, to put it mildly. I think in your if you have the Scott book, then he talks about how bad they are. But there is a preset in there called Scott 5, which is from Scott Kelby, and that one's not too bad. It has that HDR kind of look to it, very crispy, kind of high saturation, lots of detail. So if you choose that one, you'll kind of see what it looks like. Down below here, it says remove ghosts. So if I uncheck that, then it won't try to get rid of ghosting. Ghosting, again, is when there's movement between the different shots. So especially if someone's moving, they may be in the shot for one image and not in the shot for another, which is could mess up your shot, your HDR, because it's trying to put those together and there's a person there and then they're not there. We don't really have that in this one, but so I might be able to get away with not having that on, but I'm going to turn it on just to show you what it does. And when I turn it on, you'll see it has a green outline around one of these images, and that's the one it's going to use to try to get rid of the ghosting. You can change that just by clicking on a different one. And the only thing that was really moving in this scene was probably the wind was kind of blowing this tree a little bit. So I want to pick one that looks like it's not kind of blurring out from the movement. So it will try to automate it for you, but you can always choose the one you want. They're about the same. It doesn't really matter in this image too much. Down below here, you have a couple of settings. So I'm back on, let's go back to Scott 5 here, and there's a couple of settings here. There's radius. So that's the glow around the edge of highlights and shadows. So if I turn that up and then turn on the strength a little bit, you'll see this sort of white glow. That's an HDR thing that you'll see sometimes where the transitions are. Yeah, it's kind of hideous actually, but if you like that, you can turn that up. If you want to smooth it out a little bit, you can turn on this smooth edge smoothness checkbox. You can see a little bit down here, it's getting a little bit, changes a little bit. It kind of mellows it out a little bit. It's not so crazy, but you can, adjust that to what you want. These sliders will adjust brightness, the gamma will, the exposure will kind of too. You can definitely mess with these if you want. You could do a lot of this stuff later in Photoshop and Camera Raw, which I'll show you as well. So some people say not to use these too much. The one that's actually causing, let me go back to Scott 5, because every time I'm changing those, it's changing my settings. So the one that's actually doing all the HDR kind of feel is this detail slider. So if I go down to 0 or minus 100, it looks like you have like a vision problem, right? But if I go to 0, it's in the middle. Well, actually, it's not in the middle. It's like right there. Yeah, there's 0. Yeah, it's still kind of flat and kind of washed out. But you see if I go far to the plus side, it gets very crispy, right? That kind of HDR, kind of crispy, contrasty kind of look. So that's what that kind of does. There's also a shadow slider and a highlight slider that don't do as much as the ones would in Photoshop and Camera Raw, so we'll probably do that there. There's also a vibrance slider for contrast of colors that aren't really already saturated, or for saturation of colors that aren't really saturated already. And then there's a saturation slider as well. So again, you can do all that stuff in Photoshop after. So just wanted to show you that. If I go back to Scott 5, here's those settings, and you can definitely play with those and use those if you want to get that some of those looks. There's probably better apps, which I will show you, to get more of the HDR kind of look, but you can do it that way. What we're going to do is start, though, by going to do kind of a more realistic version. So I'm going to change this mode up here, which says 16-bit. I'm going to change that to 32-bit. And when you do that, all your controls go away. And you get kind of a flat look, but that's okay because we're going to work with that after. So I'm going to go ahead and say, I'm going to go ahead and check this checkbox that says complete toning in Adobe Camera Raw. We're going to do this 2 times and I'll show you the difference. But if I check that, it's going to open the image in a Camera Raw kind of adjustment thing. So I'm going to check that, click on Tone in ACR, that's Adobe Camera Raw, and you wait a couple of seconds or more. Couple hours depending on your computer, and then it comes up in Camera Raw after you get a cup of coffee and binge watch some shows. There you go. Okay, so it just came up, and then it comes up in Camera Raw because we said to tone it in Camera Raw. So here we can make our regular Camera Raw adjustments. So same thing we usually do. So I might bring up the highlights, or bring down the highlights a little bit, sorry. Bring up the shadows a little bit. And because we're working with an HDR image, there's a ton of data in here to work with. It's not just like a regular image. I'm going to go up with the whites a little bit, maybe a tiny bit more exposure because it's a little dark, right? And then bring the highlights down even more. And then bring the clarity up to make it kind of more crispy again. And I'm trying to do a realistic one, right? So I'm not going to go crazy with the vibrance or the clarity because I don't want it to look fake. I just want it to look kind of clean and nice. So So somewhere around there, maybe a little bit higher on the whites. And then that's pretty good. So it's still got some shadow, some darkness in here and some light areas. So because we're in Camera Raw, right, I can go up to my adjustment brush, which is right here. And I'm going to click on next to exposure on the little plus and add a 0.5 exposure. And also I'm going to drag over the shadow slider to about plus 75, something like that. See how that works. And then I'm going to go in this area here that's kind of dark and kind of paint in there. See, I'm painting back in some of that detail. And the file should have it in there because I'm going to do it right here too on the steps a little bit. And then maybe in this shadow area here. So what I'm kind of doing is using that to bring out some of the shadow detail, and I can always adjust that here and here while it's still selected. See, if I go too much, it looks fake, right? But I'm going to go down about right there, I think. So now I've got more detail back in these shadow areas. Maybe a little bit more there. And then maybe I want to bring down a couple of highlights too. So I'm going to click on, if I go over here to highlights and I click on the plus, anytime you do that, it kind of starts a new adjustment brush. So here's my original one, right? If I roll over it, I can see where I did those, brightened up the shadows. Now I'm going to do, I'm going to take the highlights actually and bring them down. Maybe not that much. Well, let's see. I'm just going to go over this umbrella a little bit and go over here a little bit. And maybe go up in the sky just a little bit to darken that. So what we're doing HDR. We're kind of taking these bright areas and making them darker, and the dark areas and making them brighter, and kind of getting everything visible a little bit. And obviously I could adjust that. You know, if I go too far, it looks fake. Maybe bring down the exposure a tiny bit. There you go. So there you go. Once I have that, that looks pretty good. Pretty natural, right? I can see detail in the shadows. I can see detail in the highlights. Most of those shots, this top of this umbrella was blown out. I couldn't see anything there. But because and here too, but because we shot in HDR, we have all that data to work with. So I'm going to say okay. And there it is. So there's before. Looks terrible, right? Kind of dingy and dark. And then there's after. That's pretty good. It looks pretty natural, but I can see everywhere. So if I look up here in the top, it says Untitled HDR to 16-bit. So they converted it to 16-bit right away, and from our 32-bit that we started with. And I don't really have a way to go back and make any more Camera Raw adjustments. It's because it just flattened out the image. So what it did was it kind of did a filter up here called Camera Raw filter. It was kind of like doing it like that, right? So when you do it like that, it just applies it as a filter, and you're kind of stuck with it a little bit. So I'm going to do this one more time. I'm going to go to File, Automate, and Merge to HDR Pro. And I'm going to choose the same files again. This time, yeah, that's the same files, right? And I'll say OK. So that time I edited out the boring parts for you. That's cool, right? So you didn't have to watch that. So I'm going to go ahead and check on, I'll leave Remove Go Soft this time. This time I'm going to also uncheck Complete Toning in Camera Raw, and I'll just uncheck that, and then I'll say OK. And now it's just going to not open in that Camera Raw filter, and instead just open as an image. So there it is as an image, and it looks kind of that dingy color that we saw before. So up here it says now we're at 32 bits. Instead of 16. So we have tons and tons of data in this image, but we can't really see it because it's all kind of squished in there. So I'm going to go up and I want to use that same filter, but it's grayed out, and that's because I'm at 32 bits. So I have to change my mode, my image mode. I'm going to go up to Image Mode and go to 16 bits so that more of the Photoshop stuff will work. So once I open that, I get this different dialog that's HDR toning. It thinks I want to tone this image as I convert it, but I actually don't. And I'll show you this one in a minute, but I'm just going to go where it says Method here and go change it from Local Adaptation to Exposure and Gamma. And what that kind of does is it doesn't do anything. I just leave it. I just put it on Exposure and Gamma, and then it goes back to the way it looked before I did it opened this dialog, and I'm going to say OK. The reason we did that is because we wanted to switch to 16-bit, but we didn't want it to do anything in the process. Now I can do my Camera Raw processing on this image and have it be editable. So first I'm going to go over here to my Layers palette on top of my background layer, which is my image here. I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to go convert to smart object. And we have to wait for a second for that, and then it comes up and it has this little icon that means it's now a smart object. The reason I'm doing that is because now I can use that camera raw filter and I can adjust it after the fact. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to go up to filter. Camera raw is now visible because we're at 16 bits. I'm going to go camera raw filter, and then I would do my same processing. So I'm just going to do the quick version, right? Oh, look at, he's doing all the, he doesn't know what he's doing. He's just dragging around. You get what I did, right? I'm just showing you what I'm processing here. Let's say that's what I wanted. It's not really, but I'm going to say it is. I'm going to say OK, and there's my new image. But now it's down here as a smart filter. So on this one, the first one we did, there's no smart filter. So my processing that I did in Camera Raw, which I was more careful with, is kind of baked into the image. Now I'm stuck with it a little bit. But here I'm not. So I could double click that, or actually double click here on Camera Raw filter, and it opens back in the Camera Raw. All right. So now I can go in and adjust it again. I could go back and do more my painting in of, highlights and shadows kind of thing. Whatever I want to do. The same stuff I did on the previous one. And I say OK at the end, and it's updated. But if I want to edit it again, I just double click it again. Pretty sweet, right? So if you want to do that and have it more flexible and editable, you need to convert it to 16-bit. So it says 16-bit up here, or 16, that's next to the RGB. And then make it a smart object so you can edit that smart filter. You could also save it as a TIFF and then open it in Camera Raw, but that's kind of flaky. So there's more than one way to do all this stuff, obviously. All right, so I think that's pretty good. I wanted to just go back to this one just for a second to show you. This is our first one that we did, yeah. And just to show you a little Camera Raw kind of look that you can add if you want. What I'm going to do, this is my first image. I'm going to take this image or this layer and duplicate it. So I'm going to drag it to the new layer icon. So now I've got two of the same layer. I'm on the first image that we did. And now I'm going to go to filter and blur and Gaussian blur and blur it a lot, like really fuzzy. There we go, something like that. And you're like, Mark, that looks terrible. This is terrible, but it can be fixed. So all I have to do over here is now go over here and change the blending mode. So blending modes are right here. I'm going to go to, let's go to soft light. And actually, if you want to try the different blending modes, make sure you're on the move tool, and you can hold down your shift and hit plus and minus, and you can cycle through different blending modes. So what I'm doing is I have this blurry copy of my HDR image on top of my regular one, and I'm cycling through blending modes. If you look over here, they're changing to the different blending modes. So it's a quick way to see, ooh, that's kind of interesting, right? It's a quick way to see some different versions, but the one I was if you do this screen, it makes it kind of light and kind of airy and dreamy, like, oh, it's a beautiful wedding or something like that. If you do some of the later ones, it gets dark. Oh no, it's Voldemort's coming, right? So it's dark and it's the same kind of stuff they do in films, actually. So I'm gonna go back to, actually pin light looks pretty good too. So I'm gonna go to, which one was I on? Soft light. Let's go to soft light. There's soft light. It adds contrast, but if I turn off that layer, you can see before and after. So it's just a quick way to add some sort of misty kind of feel to it, but if you change the blending mode, you can definitely change how it's going to look. So these basically make them darker. These will make them lighter. And then you can do some that do some crazy stuff like that, right? So just a little tip. All right. Whoa, and that's back to normal. That doesn't look great, right? Yeah, multiply. Let's go back to soft light. Okay, so there's soft light. Okay, so I think that is good for doing it in Photoshop. One more way is different way you can open it, and I wanted to show you that. So I'm going to go to File, Open in Photoshop this time instead of, instead of going to Automate and Merge to HDR Pro, I'm going to go to File and Open. And this time I'm going to select all 7 of those images and click Open. They're not opening as an HDR though. They're just opening in. All right, sorry about that. My Photoshop crashed. Great product, Adobe. Anyways, I'm going to go to File, and what I was showing you is I'm going to open them in a film strip. I'm going to go to File, Open, and I'm going to choose those same images again, and hopefully it doesn't crash this time. Click Open, cross my fingers. Aha! It opened. Okay, so I just opened all those images in Camera Raw at once, right? If you select more than one image and open it, it opens this little film strip thing. So if you wanted to, you could make adjustments individually to different images here using any of the Camera Raw tools, which I'm not going to do because it would take us an hour. But I could do any of those images individually, and then I'm going to select all. So I did Command A, or I can hold down, click on one, or hold down Shift and click on the last one, same effect. And then I can go up and click on Film Strip. Next to Film Strip, there's a tiny little menu, and I can say Merge to HDR. And then it does the same thing that we saw before. It's going to open them in HDR. So we don't need to watch that again, but that's another way to do it. If you want to make individual adjustments before you open them in HDR, like if you want to change a specific thing on a specific image. So you'll get this little dialog, but basically I can click Merge and it'll do that for me. So I'm going to cancel out of that. All right. Last thing to show you in Photoshop before I show you the other apps is you can do this stuff on a single image as well. So I'm going to go to File and Open, and I'm going to open just one of those NEFs. I think number 2 or number 4 is the one I want. Yeah, sure. Doesn't really matter. And I'm going to say Open. It does matter, but not for this purposes. So here it is. Let's say I'm going to click Open Image. I didn't even do anything inside of HDR. But now I've got my one image open, my NEF open, and I'm going to go to Filter and Image, and then Adjustments and HDR Toning. This works on JPEGs as well. So if you go to, I could have opened any old image and done that. I didn't even have to go to HDR in the first place, but I can go to Image, Adjustments, and HDR Toning. And then I get this HDR toning dialog box, which we saw before. And you can see that it processes as an HDR, even though it's just one image, right? It does help if it's a raw image. But I have the same presets in here as well. I still have my Scott 5 that I could play with. But it's more pronounced, right? It's much more crazy, contrasty, and it hurts my eyeballs, actually. But yeah, I don't know why that is, but I can definitely mess with it and mellow it out a little bit, turn down the detail a little bit, turn down maybe the vibrance and saturation is hurting my eyeballs. But make it look more realistic or less, whatever you want. And there's tons of options in here that we don't really have time to go over. But that's also in there, and you can do that on any image. I could go and open a JPEG. I could go to File, Open, and open a JPEG. Just any old JPEG. Here's a JPEG number 3. Let's open it up. This is not an HDR image. It's just a JPEG. Wow, that is really dark. But if I go to Image Mode, or Image Adjustments and HDR Toning, I can do, wow, it did get some information out there. So I can do HDR type processing on one image only if I want to. All right, so I wanted to show you that. Make sure you knew that was there. It can be fun to kind of do that kind of stuff and get that, use that kind of HDR look on regular old images, fashion and stuff like that. It's pretty cool. All right, so next we will take a look at a couple of other apps that you could also use to do HDR. All right, this is just another app that you can use. I'm going to show you 3 more actually. Just super quick, just to let you know that they exist. So this one's called Photomatics or Photomatics Pro. I just have the demo version, so I'm just going to click Continue Trials after you install it. And it says Browse and Load to load images. So I'm going to click Browse and Load, and I will load the same 7 images. Wow, I'm tired of these images. So are you, but that's okay. I'm going to click Load. And this was kind of the go-to app before Photoshop, or it's still used by tons of people. So it does kind of a more detailed job than Photoshop does in HDR. So okay, so I chose the images. Yeah, I'm going to choose all those. It says choose merge options. I'm just going to leave it the way it is. It says align images. I could do ghosting, but I'm not going to get into that because I'm just showing you the app real fast. There's raw conversion options in here, all kinds of stuff. But we're just going to leave it the way it is. It's probably going to be fine. and say align and merge to HDR. And then we wait for it to do its magical processing again. All right, I cut out the middleman on that, or the middle time, so you wouldn't have to watch the progress bars. But here's what Photomatix looks like. So it has tons of controls. They are kind of intimidating, right? There's like, geez, how many controls? Like there's 10 right there. There's another 3, 4, 5. That's not even all of them. If you go under here, there's like 9 different categories of controls or styles or processes, and they all have different controls. It's just nuts. Thankfully, over here on the right, you've got a bunch of presets. So they are broken down as well. There's all styles. There's artistic, realistic, architecture, black and white, details, all kinds of stuff. You can just say all styles if you want, and then you'll see every preset. And there's lots of them. But then you can just kind of click on them. So here's one called Natural. And you see I'm not doing anything, right? I'm just clicking on these presets. That's called Photographic. Here's Balanced. If you want to go nutty for the HDR look, there's Painterly 3. And you can see it does a pretty nice job. Definitely has that HDR look. Super contrasty, high saturation, lots of detail. Sometimes it hurts your eyes. Some of these will be painful. There's realistic ones. There's some for interiors. So a lot of HDR, I didn't mention that, but a lot of shots that you see of rentals like Airbnb or hotels or all kinds of rental properties or sales properties, you'll see HDRs used in the shots to show the room nicely and then also be able to see out the window and that kind of thing. So HDR is used a ton in architecture. There's people that have their jobs like run around and take HDRs of interiors of houses. Anyway, so here's, wow, that one is, yeah, that's like, Alice in Wonderland kind of look. So that is that one. I mentioned these controls are intimidating. The good thing about it is if you open up this little help reveal down here, if you roll over any of these controls, it'll tell you what it does. So obviously you could choose any of these different presets and then start messing with the controls and get what you want. Well, it's not letting me mess with those, but yeah, there we go. And then it'll tell you kind of as you're doing that. And you can also save your preset. So there's save preset right there. I could save any preset that I like. If I make a different version of, let's say, this natural one that I like and I want to save it, I can just go to here to preset and save preset. So that is Photomatix. It's about $50 to $100. I think there might be educational discounts, but there's a demo, but I think it has a watermark. So, but it's a great app for HDR. And next I'm going to show you Aurora. All right, so this app is called Aurora HDR. This is a kind of a newer version, so it's a little buggy. We'll see if it's working. I'm gonna go ahead and click on Open Image. And I'm going to go to those files that I've been working with here. And I'm just gonna choose the JPEGs this time. 7 JPEGs, they're the same as the 7 NEF files. And it says HDR image will be made from this. Yes, I want to check alignment to try it so it aligns them. And I'll say create HDR. And so this has a ton of options as well. Each of these apps you could have probably a whole semester class on, to be honest with you. But this one is pretty cool. It has some cool presets, if it opens, from some people that are pretty famous as far as people that do HDR. All right, so this is how it opens, and it starts from kind of a default kind of natural feel, and it does a really good job. So you can see into the shadows and the highlights again. But up here at the top, you click on this button if it's not visible, and down here at the bottom, oops, there it is a bunch of presets. So there are categories here. If you click on categories, 2 of them are well-known people that do HDR. One is Trey Radcliffe, which we saw earlier maybe in the video. And then he's got all these presets in here that he has developed for this app. So this one's called Epic Vodka Party. This one's called Idea Objectivity. You get the idea, right? So there's a bunch of presets in here. There's also, you can start with any of those just like on the previous app or the other apps, and you can mess with them with all these different controls. It's kind of like a mini version of Photoshop, especially made for HDR photography. It does have layers. It has all kinds of different options. They do have another product that's kind of like a Photoshop competitor as well. But so that is called Aurora HDR. That's definitely a good option if you want to try that one out. I think that one's about $100, but I think there is an educational discount for that one as well. All right, so the last app, thank goodness it's the last app that I'm going to show you is good old Lightroom. So Lightroom does HDR as well, at least the last version before the classic and the new CC online version and all that stuff. But anyway, so here's the same 7 images again inside of Lightroom. So I'm going to do Command A to select them all. And I'm going to go to Photo and Photo Merge and HDR. And I get just a real simple dialog box. It has options to auto align and auto tone the images. You can turn those on or off. And then it has de-ghost amount. So again, that's the ghosting. If you don't think there's any ghosting in your images, you could turn it off. I'm going to put it on low and then see how it does, because there's not, again, the only movement probably was in this tree here. And it's doing its little building up preview. And then when that's done, I'm going to go ahead and click merge. And it merges those into a new image. So here's my new image. Actually, it's this one. And if I go to develop, you can use the same development tools as usual. A lot of them are similar to the Camera Raw tools, but here's what it got, what it gave me. It added that into my catalog, and then I can do whatever I want to do in Lightroom that way too. So anyway, so lots of apps you can use to do the HDR. HDR is a big thing. It's been big for a while. A lot of people do it and do some pretty cool work with it. So go ahead and check it out, and I'll talk to you again later.